Hello, my name is Paul Arnott and I'm the chair of Acorn Press, which earlier this year published Bernie Power's book, Understanding Jesus and Muhammad. Bernie teaches at the Melbourne School of Theology and has lived and worked in Middle Eastern countries with Muslims for over 20 years. And we are speaking with Bernie right now. Bernie, what motivated you to write Understanding Jesus and Muhammad?
Yeah, basically, I wanted to make the lives of Jesus and Muhammad, the things they did and the things they said, accessible to the public. A lot of people think that you need to have a degree in history or a deep understanding of Arabic in order to be able to do that. But I just wanted to in effect, let Jesus and Muhammad speak for themselves.
How do you think your experience of living and working in the Middle East for 2 decades shaped your writing of the book?
Certainly, as I lived there, I saw many Muslim people had absolute ignorance about Jesus, about who he was, what he said, what he did. And back in Australia, I find a similar kind of ignorance by Australian people about Muhammad. But also, some Australian people don't know very much about Jesus, and many Muslim people have got a very fleeting knowledge of Muhammad. So it's really responding to those issues.
You've suggested that the future of civilisation may depend on the response of humanity to Jesus and Muhammad, to how people respond to those two individuals. Mm-hmm. That's a pretty bold claim to make.
Yeah. In the 1990s, Samuel Huntington wrote a book called The Clash of Civilisations. And in his view, the nexus, the connection between Islam and the West was going to be one of the major points for conflict in the future. Recent events have shown that to be true, and certainly that's the direction. And I think as we look at Jesus and Muhammad, we can see two men who have quite different understandings of how the future could be, and that's being reflected.
Isn't there a difference, though, between Huntington's thesis that the clash will be between Islam and Christianity and saying the clash is between certain elements of Islam and the West?
Certainly, and I think that's important that we nuance Islam. We don't put it all as one block and assume all Muslims are the same, but Islam is a spectrum, so you've got the radicals, you've got the traditionalists, you've got liberals as well, and we need to respond differently to each of those groups.
Bernie, one reviewer of your book has suggested that you set Muhammad up as a straw man and then knock him down. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, the person who wrote this seemed to have a bit of an agenda, and I think any kind of exposure of Muhammad that wasn't positive from his perspective would be seen as a straw man. He quotes Karen Armstrong as someone who does this better. She actually doesn't really do that very well. She gives you a rose-coloured, airbrushed view of Muhammad. But I wanted to go back into the original documents and have a look at Muhammad and what he said about himself and what his companions said about him.
Another critic has suggested that your book is biased in an unhelpful way.
There's no such thing as absolute lack of bias. Every person has their bias, and I would suggest that person also had their bias as well. But to speak honestly about the evidence that we've received, I think is another thing altogether, and we need to be clear about that.
Bernie, how have the Muslims who've read your book responded to it?
Yes, I've had a range of responses. So some have found it very helpful. It's given them information which they didn't have otherwise, and we're very grateful for that. Others, as you mentioned, thought it to be unhelpful and biased and hypocritical. And I would expect that you would get a range of responses from Muslim people.
Many or maybe most Western leaders seem to be saying that Islam is a religion of peace. I've heard President Obama say this, David Cameron from the UK say it, and some have suggested that this shows a significant degree of naivety about radical Islam and its goals. Your comment?
Yes, so maybe 2 comments. Firstly, on the idea of Islam as a religion of peace, what does that term actually mean? If it means that most Muslims are peaceful, then we wouldn't have any problem with that, because that's what we're seeing in the world, and that's what we've seen throughout history. If it means that Islam, when it comes, always brings peace, I'm afraid the evidence of history is against that. We don't always see that, and certainly as we're seeing radical Islam take a bit of a foothold in many nations, then we're not seeing peace there, but rather the reverse. And when you talk about Western leaders being naive about radical Islam, well, they've really got no excuse, because radical Islam has been very clear about what its purposes are, what its ultimate goals are, and its methodologies. And to be ignorant about those would be negligent in the extreme.
So why are Western leaders continually saying that Islam is a religion of peace? What's behind this?
Yeah, I think there's a desire there to maintain social harmony, and that's really important. Also, they don't want to, in a sense, stigmatise all Muslims as belonging to the radical group, and that's why I talk about having a nuanced approach to Muslims and seeing them as radical, traditional and liberal, and recognising that they're quite different.
Can't it be argued, though, that there are sections of the Bible, even the New Testament, but especially the Old Testament, that seem to condone violence and even genocide?
Certainly, and we need to again look at that evidence very clearly. There are differences in the way that the Bible talks about violence, both the justification for it and the means in which it's carried out, compared with the way that the radical Muslims would interpret the Quran and the life of Muhammad and Islamic history. And so just to say, well, that violence is the same as that violence is not honest.
Now, one of your arguments in the book is that violence and hatred on the part of the Islamists derive from their reading of the Quran and the Hadith. Isn't that, in a sense, playing into their hands to argue that?
No, because that's what they're doing themselves. If you go onto the Islamist websites like the magazine Dabiq, ISIS's magazine, you can see everything that they do is justified from verses from the Quran, from the life of Muhammad, or from the teaching of Islamic scholars throughout the ages. So people need to understand the facts in order to be able to counter those, rather than just pretending that it's not true, that it's not happening.
What do you believe is the long-term goal of Islam as against the long-term goal of a group like ISIS?
Yeah, certainly ISIS has made clear its goals, and they've said we want to run the black flag on the White House and on top of Buckingham Palace, and ultimately to rule over the world. For most Muslims, they just want to live a peaceful life. My next door neighbours are Muslims, and I have meals with Muslims constantly. And for them, it's the things like getting on with your job, having a family, looking after your children, maintaining good relationships with your neighbours. So that's where the divide is within Islam.
The response to the present crisis, particularly in regard to ISIS, seems to be on the part of some people the Donald Trump response. Let's put up the barricade, let's stop these people from coming to our country. Is that a helpful way to go?
No, I don't think it is. I think it's very naive in the extreme, in that it basically brands all Muslims as the same, and in fact we can't do that, and we shouldn't do that.
Bernie Power, many thanks.
Thank you very much.